The sound was the first to attack. A cacophony of shouted orders, the high-pitched whine of generators and the metallic scrape of heavy equipment being dragged across the studio floor. For Finn Carvalho, each noise was like a physical needle, piercing the protective layer he tried to maintain around himself. Then came the lights, merciless and hot, that seemed to suck the air and make his eyes burn. He huddled in his background actor chair, an anonymous villager on the set of a fantasy epic, and did the only thing he knew how to do to silence the chaos. He picked up his worn notebook and a pencil. Paper was his safe harbor, graphite, his anchor. As he drew the scales of a dragon that existed only in his mind, the outside world dissolved. The noises became a distant murmur and the lights just a glare in his periphery. He was no longer in a noisy studio. He was in a world of misty mountains and majestic creatures. It was in this moment of peace that a shadow fell across his page. Gruff voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through his silence. "What do you think you're doing?" Finn looked up, startled. The man towering over him was Michael Moretti, the film's producer, whose face he'd only seen in photos. "We're trying to make a movie here, not an art club. Pay attention." Moretti snatched the notebook from his hands. For a second, he glanced at the dragon drawing, a creature of stunning detail. A flicker of something that might have been surprise crossed his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by impatience. He tore the page in half, then again, and let the pieces flutter to the ground like lifeless confetti. "We don't pay you to doodle." Finn felt the air leave his lungs. The world rushed back in full force, louder and crueler than before. Every curious glance from the other extras, every whisper, was a fresh blow. He stood there, paralyzed, staring at the remains of his dragon on the floor, his sanctuary violated and destroyed. How could someone take a piece of another person's soul and simply tear it apart? And by the way, where are you watching this story from today? Tell us in the comments. And if you don't want to miss incredible stories of overcoming adversity like this, subscribe right now, because what happens next is proof that talent always finds a way. The person who best understood what that notebook meant was his older sister, Julia Santos. To her, Finn wasn't just her brother. He was a universe of quiet wonders that few people had the patience to explore. Since childhood, Finn had communicated with the world through lines and shadows. While other children learned to form sentences, he learned to bring worlds to life on paper. Julia remembered when he was 6 years old and the autism diagnosis arrived. For their parents, it was a frightening label, an explanation for why he didn't make eye contact, why loud noises startled him, and why he preferred spending hours lining up his dinosaur figures to playing with other children. But for Julia, the diagnosis changed nothing. He was still the same Finn, the boy who could see patterns in tree bark that no one else saw, who was fascinated by the way light filtered through a glass of water, creating dancing rainbows on the kitchen table. Drawing was more than a hobby. It was his native language. When he was happy, he drew flying creatures with expansive wings and vibrant colors. When he was sad or overwhelmed, his drawings became dense, filled with intricate labyrinths and figures hidden in shadows. Julia learned to read his emotions in the pages of his countless notebooks. She saw the genius there, a perception of the world that was unique and profound. The problem was that the rest of the world rarely saw beyond the silence and the behavior they deemed odd. At school, he was the quiet kid in the back of the room, who doodled in his books instead of raising his hand. Some teachers ignored him. Others reprimanded him for not paying attention, without realizing that for Finn, drawing was the most intense form of concentration there was. Julia became his advocate, his translator. She patiently explained to teachers, "He's listening. Drawing helps him process." Sometimes it worked. Often, it didn't. The world wasn't built for minds like Finn's. The invitation to be an extra in the film, Chronicles of Ethelgard, felt like a miracle. Finn was obsessed with fantasy films. He didn't just watch them, he dissected them. He would pause scenes to study the architecture of castles, the texture of monster skin, the physics of a spell. He collected the art of books, filling his own notebooks with his interpretations and improvements of the designs he saw on screen. Being part of an actual production, even as a blurry figure in the background, was the dream of his life. Julia helped him sign up. She remembered the pure joy on his face when the confirmation email arrived. He didn't shout or jump. His joy was quieter, but far deeper. He spent the following weeks preparing, He researched everything about the film, read the books it was based on, and studied the concept art that had been released. He arrived on set that day not just as an extra, but as a pilgrim arriving at a sacred place. Julia had been apprehensive, but his happiness was contagious. She thought that maybe this time it would be different. Maybe, in a place dedicated to creating imaginary worlds, her brother's imagination would finally be seen as a gift, not a distraction. The call she received from him that afternoon broke her heart. He wasn't crying. Finn rarely cried. His voice was monotone, empty, as if all the color had been drained from it. He recounted what happened factually, without emotion. But Julia knew his silence. She knew that behind that calm voice lay a pain so deep there were no words to describe it. Michael Moretti hadn't just torn a piece of paper. He had taken Finn's dream, the purest and most precious thing he had, and desecrated it in front of everyone. He had confirmed Finn's worst fear, that his inner world, his true essence, had no place in the real world. When Finn arrived home, he went straight to his room, gathered all his drawing notebooks, years of work, of emotion, of life, and put them in a box at the back of his closet. Then, he closed the door, and for the first time in his life, the silence coming from his room wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a universe shutting down. Before that fateful day on set, the family's life had already been a long road of dashed hopes. Every new therapy, every new specialist, was presented as a potential solution to Finn's autism. They had tried everything. Occupational therapists who tried to desensitize him to textures he couldn't stand. Speech therapists who worked on his conversational skills. Psychologists who gave him social scripts for normal interactions. Finn participated in it all with a quiet resignation, but Julia saw the weariness in his eyes. They were trying to teach him to speak the world's language, but no one was trying to learn his. The most common and most painful advice came from well-meaning people. Relatives who said, "He just needs to try harder to be social." Neighbors who suggested, "Maybe if you forced him to go to more parties, he'd get used to it." Each suggestion was a small stab, an implication that Finn's way of being was something to be fixed, a flaw to be corrected. The pressure from school was the worst. Meetings with principals and counselors who spoke of reaching milestones and integrating with peers. They looked at Finn's perfect grades in math and physics, but worried about his lack of participation in group activities. They saw a problem to be solved, not a person to be understood. Finn's family, especially his father, Louis Azevedo, lived in a state of subtle denial for a time. He loved his son fiercely, but struggled to accept that Finn's future might not be what he had envisioned. He encouraged him to play sports, to join clubs, hoping some spark of normalcy would ignite. It was a hope born of love, but it placed immense pressure on Finn, who felt he was constantly disappointing everyone. The opportunity to be an extra in Chronicles of Ethelgard came like a ray of sunshine on a cloudy sky. It was the first time something Finn genuinely loved aligned with a real-world opportunity. It wasn't therapy or a social obligation. It was passion. For the family, this was the greatest hope of all. Perhaps this was the path, the bridge between Finn's inner world and the outside world. They imagined that, surrounded by other creatives, he might finally find his place. Finn's preparation for that day was meticulous. He not only drew the film's creatures but also wrote notes on their speculative biology, their movement patterns, how their skins and scales would react to different lighting conditions. He was immersed in that universe in a way that likely even the film's creators weren't. When he left home that morning, notebook under his arm, there was a light in his eyes that Julia hadn't seen in years. It was the light of genuine hope. That's why the humiliation was so devastating. It wasn't just an act of rudeness from a stressed producer. It was the embodiment of all the rejections he had ever suffered. The fantasy world, his last refuge, had proven to be as cruel and uncomprehending as the real world. The incident confirmed the message he had been receiving his whole life. You don't belong. Your way of being is wrong. The false hope had shattered brutally, leaving behind an even greater void than before. That torn piece of paper on the studio floor wasn't just a drawing. It was the symbol of a door that had been slammed shut violently, perhaps forever. The family, who had placed so many expectations on that day, now found themselves lost, facing Finn's silence, a silence that now echoed with the sound of a dream being broken. After the incident, the house felt different. Finn's silence, which had once been a calm and contemplative presence, was now heavy, dense as fog. He stopped drawing altogether. The box in the back of his closet was like a tomb for the most vibrant part of him. He spent most of his time in his room, the door closed, not with the glow of a computer screen or the sound of a movie, but in an almost absolute silence. Julia felt a helpless anger gnawing at her from the inside. Her urge was to march to the studios, find Michael Moretti, and make him understand the magnitude of the damage he had caused. But what would she say? How could she explain to him that he hadn't just reprimanded an extra, but had broken someone's spirit? The family's dilemma was paralyzing. Louis, his father, wanted to file a formal complaint. His mother, Isabella Omar, feared the repercussions. "They're powerful," she'd say, her voice trembling. "They could label us problematic. They could make things even worse for Finn." It was a human and painfully real conflict. There were no clear villains, just people with different perspectives and fears. Michael Moretti, in his own mind, was not a monster. He was a man managing a $200 million budget, with hundreds of people under his responsibility and a relentless deadline. In a brief conversation with his assistant, Camille Weber, the next day, he mentioned the incident briefly. "Had to deal with a kid who was daydreaming," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "We don't have time for dreamers on this set. We need focus." To him, Finn was just an insignificant detail, a minor distraction in a chaotic day. He lacked the capacity or the interest to see the universe that existed behind that quiet young man's eyes. He saw the behavior, not the person. This was the core of the conflict, the world's inability to stop and look closer. Society, like Moretti, often operates on efficiency and conformity. Anyone who deviates from the norm is seen as a problem to be managed or discarded. Finn felt this judgment everywhere. The pitying looks from neighbors, the barely disguised frustration of some family members, the indifference of the system. The deepest conflict, however, happened within Finn himself. His love for film, the only passion that connected him to the outside world, was now irrevocably tainted by the trauma. He could no longer watch a movie without remembering Moretti's angry face, the sound of paper tearing, the feeling of public humiliation. The place that was once his refuge was now a source of pain. He was at war with himself, his love for art fighting against the memory of the pain it had caused him. Julia tried to reach him, but it was like banging on a glass door. She could see him but couldn't get through. She'd leave his favorite meals by the door, buy art books he loved and leave them on his bed. He touched nothing. The family was adrift, each dealing with the pain in their own way. Louis with anger, Isabella with fear, and Julia with an overwhelming sadness. They realized the problem wasn't Finn's autism. The problem was a world that refused to make space for him. The months that followed were gray and long. The box in Finn's closet remained closed, and with it, a vital part of the family's soul. Julia refused to accept this as the end of the story. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't give up. One day, while tidying the garage, she found something they had, bought for Finn years earlier in yet another attempt to find an outlet for him. An old but functional graphics tablet. It was covered in dust, forgotten in a corner. A quiet idea formed in her mind. Without fanfare, without a grand speech, she carefully cleaned it, found all the cables, installed the drivers on Finn's computer, and left it on his desk while he slept. She said nothing. There was no pressure, no expectation. It was just a silent offering, a slightly ajar door left in the dark. For weeks, the graphics tablet remained untouched. Finn would move it aside to use his keyboard, treating it as just another object in his room. Julia's heart sank a little each day. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the damage was too deep. Then, late one night when the house was quiet, she passed by his room and heard a sound she hadn't heard in a long time. It wasn't the scratch of a pencil on paper, but a light rhythmic tapping on a plastic surface. She peeked through the crack in the door. The only light in the room was the glow of the monitor, and on it, Finn was drawing. He wasn't just doodling. He was immersed. He had downloaded 3D modeling software and was digitally sculpting a creature of breathtaking complexity. The lines were precise, the textures realistic. The digital world offered him something paper couldn't, a universe he could control completely, without the risk of it being torn or judged. It was a silent turning point, a change that happened in the quiet of his room. away from the world's gaze. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in the heart of the chronicles of Ethel Garden's post-production, another crisis was unfolding. Alexei Georgiou Koch, the visual effects supervisor, a veteran of the industry known for his artistic eye, was at an impasse. The skylark, the film's main creature, wasn't working. The 3D models were technically perfect, but they lacked life. It lacks soul, the director Daniel Martin kept saying. Frustrated, Alexei spent his nights browsing digital art forums and portfolio sites, searching for a spark of inspiration. That's when he found it. An anonymous portfolio, no name, no contact, just the initials, FC. The images were otherworldly, creatures that seemed to have a story, a biology, a soul. There was an understanding of light, anatomy, and movement that was simply genius. One of the pieces was a dragon whose scales seemed to reflect not just light, but the very history of its lineage. Alexei was obsessed. He had to find that artist. With no other option, he left a public message on one of the forums. I am the VFX supervisor for a major feature film, and am looking for the artist behind the FC portfolio. Your work is extraordinary. Please get in touch. The turning point wasn't a grand explosive event, but the silent collision of two needs, that of an artist who needed a safe haven to create, and that of a project that desperately needed that artist's unique vision. It was Julia who saw Alexei's message. She followed the forums Finn used to frequent, a way to stay connected to him even in his silence. When she read the film's name and the initials FC, her heart leaped. She opened the link to the portfolio, and there they were, the creatures Finn had been creating in secret in his room over the past few weeks. They were magnificent. Carefully, she printed Alexei's post and left it on Finn's desk, next to the graphics tablet. Again, without a word. The next morning, the paper was gone. That night, Finn came to the living room where Julia was reading and stood in the doorway. "They're from the movie," he said, the first non-monosyllabic words he'd directed at her in months. "The movie that—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Julia replied softly. "But they're not looking for you, Finn, they're looking for the artist." The idea terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. Go back to that world? But the proposal was different. It was anonymous. It was about his art. With Julia's help acting as his intermediary and shield, they drafted a cautious email to Alexei. It was the first small victory. Finn agreed to communicate. Alexei's response was immediate and enthusiastic. He didn't ask personal questions. He got straight to the point. "Your work is incredible. We have a creature, the skylark, that isn't working. Would you be interested in attempting a redesign? No commitment." He attached the non-disclosure agreement and the 3D model files. This became Finn's sole focus. He dove into the project with an intensity that was his trademark. He didn't just redesign the skylark, he rebuilt it from scratch. He considered its skeletal structure, the way muscles would connect to its wings for aerodynamically credible flight, how the film's ambient light would refract through its iridescent feathers. He created a short animation, a movement test, showing the skylark landing on a branch, its head tilting with an almost intelligent curiosity. It was more than a monster. It was a character. He sent the files back to Alexei. The second victory came in the form of an email from Alexei a few hours later, the text of which simply read, "Where have you been all my life? The director is crying, literally. We have a proposal for you." They offered him a remote freelancer contract to work on the rest of the film's creatures. The name on the contract was Finn Carvalho, but to the crew, he was simply FC, a mysterious genius who communicated only via email and delivered work of astonishing quality. Every file he sent was a small victory. Every positive feedback was a balm to the wound that was still open. He was working on the film that had been the source of his greatest pain, but now he did so from a position of power, protected by anonymity and the undeniable force of his talent. He didn't need to look anyone in the eye nor make small talk. He just needed to create. And for the first time, the world asked nothing more of him. He started, leaving his bedroom door open again. Sometimes Julia would find him in the dead of night still working, a faint smile on his face as he adjusted the skin texture of a golem or the luminescence of a fairy. The sound of the stylus tapping on the tablet became the new soundtrack of the house, a melody of healing and rediscovery. These were small victories, but together, They were rebuilding a universe. Finn's work on the film became a healthy obsession. His mind, which saw the world in patterns and systems, was perfectly suited to the technical and artistic complexity of visual effects. He wasn't just a designer, he was a problem solver. His attention to detail, often seen as an eccentricity in his daily life, became his greatest professional asset. He noticed things no one else did. A slight inconsistency in how a shadow fell on a curved surface, the unrealistic way dust settled on armor, the lack of muscle tension in a creature's wing during a flight maneuver. He sent detailed emails to Alexei, filled with technical observations and suggestions. At first, the animation team was a bit intimidated by this anonymous and incredibly demanding collaborator, but they soon realized that FC's notes made their work better, more real, more impactful. He wasn't criticizing, he was elevating the project. Julia watched this transformation with a sense of profound awe. She reflected on all the years they had tried to help Finn fit in, to adapt to a world that wasn't willing to bend an inch for him. All those therapies and well-meaning advice were focused on changing Finn, on sanding down his edges so he could fit into a square hole. But now she saw the truth with a painful and beautiful clarity. The goal should never have been to change Finn. The goal should have been to find the place where his edges weren't flaws, but rather the perfect tools for the job. The digital world was that place. Behind the screen, his intense focus wasn't a social deficit, but productive, hyperfocus. His direct, no-nonsense communication wasn't rudeness, but efficient clarity. His acute sensory perception wasn't a weakness, but a superpower that allowed him to see flaws invisible to neurotypical eyes. The humiliation on set, as terrible as it was, ultimately became an unintentional catalyst. That act of cruelty pushed him away from the path of trying to conform. It forced him to retreat into the only place where he felt safe, his inner world. And it was in that refuge that he found a new tool, the graphics tablet, which allowed him to translate his inner universe to the outside world in a more powerful and controlled way than ever before. Julia realized that true acceptance wasn't tolerating someone's differences. It was recognizing that those differences could be sources of extraordinary strength. Finn wasn't overcoming his autism. He was, finally, being allowed to use it to its full potential. He wasn't healing, he was flourishing. The irony was almost poetic. He was saving the visual universe of the very film that had nearly destroyed his. He was working indirectly for Michael Moretti, the man who had humiliated him. But there was no bitterness in Finn. He wasn't interested in revenge. His entire being was focused on the joy of creation, the satisfaction of solving a complex problem, the beauty of bringing to life something that had previously existed only in his imagination. He was finding his own redemption, not through confrontation, but through the silent excellence of his work. The transformation was real, but it wasn't magic. There were difficult days when the anxiety returned, and he shut down. But now there was a fundamental difference. He had a purpose, an outlet for his energy, a place where he was not just accepted but celebrated, even if anonymously. He was rewriting his own story, not by changing who he was, but by changing how his value was measured. Chronicles of Ethelgard was released to thunderous success. Critics praised the story, the acting, but they were unanimous on one point. The visual effects were revolutionary. The creatures in particular were described as painfully real and full of unexpected soul. The Skylark became an instant cultural icon. Behind the scenes of the industry, the name FC began to become a legend, the mysterious digital artist who had elevated the film to another level. In interviews, Michael Moretti boasted about the success. "We always knew we had something special," he'd tell reporters. "Our philosophy is to find the best talent no matter where they are, and give them the freedom to create." He had no idea that the talent that had saved his film was the very young man he had dismissed as a useless dreamer. The pain of that day on set didn't magically disappear for Finn. It was a scar he would always carry. But now, he had tools to deal with it. His work was one of them. The confidence he built, the validation of his talent on his own terms, was another. He no longer needed the world's approval in the same way. He had created his own space of value. Alexei, feeling it was time, extended an invitation to Finn. There would be a private screening for the visual effects team. an intimate celebration of their work. "I completely understand if you don't want to come," Alexei wrote, "but the work you've done, people here see you as a hero. They'd like to thank you." Finn was terrified of the idea. The crowds, the faces, the small talk. But Julia saw a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "I'll go with you," she said. "We'll stay in the back. If it gets too much, we'll leave immediately. No questions asked." He agreed. On the night of the screening, they entered the small cinema and sat in the very last row. Finn kept the hood of his sweatshirt pulled up. But as the film unfolded on the big screen, he began to relax, seeing his creatures, not on his monitor, but alive, breathing, interacting with the world, was an overwhelming and wonderful experience. He didn't see the pain, he saw the art, he saw the beauty he had created. As the credits rolled, and the name Finn Carvalho appeared under the lead creature design section, a spontaneous round of applause erupted in the room. Alexei stepped onto the small stage at the front of the screen. He thanked the entire team, naming dozens of artists. "But there is one person," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who was the heart and soul of our creations. The genius we've, only known as FC, who gave us not just designs but characters, and I believe he is with us tonight." A spotlight began to sweep across the audience. Panic seized Finn. He started to shrink away. "Finn Carvalho," Alexei said. "Would you please stand up?" The light found him. The cinema fell silent. In the front row, Michael Moretti, who was there to give a thank you speech, turned around. His face went from confusion to recognition, and finally, to a pale, sickly shock. The memory of the boy, with the notebook of the torn paper, came back with the force of a punch. He understood everything in that instant. Finn was frozen. Julia placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of support. He looked at the faces of the VFX team, artists like him, and saw no pity. He saw admiration. He saw respect. He saw gratitude. Slowly, he stood up. The silence in the room was dense. Moretti seemed to have shrunk in his chair. Finn didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then, he sat down. The applause that followed was deafening. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a silent, powerful revenge, achieved not through anger, but through excellence. As they left the cinema, side by side with Julia, Finn wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking straight ahead. A subtle but genuine smile touched his lips. The pain was still there, somewhere, but it no longer defined him. He had found his voice in his creations, and the world finally was learning to listen. Finn's story isn't about a miraculous cure, but about finding the right environment to flourish. It's a testament that talent knows no labels and that strength often lies precisely in what the world perceives as weakness. The true victory wasn't the humiliation of a producer, but the moment a young artist stood up and was finally seen for who he truly was. If this story touched you in any way, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes, the person who most needs to hear a message of hope is the one we least expect. Someone might need to hear this today.